Welcome to Standard 9A. As you can see looking at your screen, 9A is an extensive standard where we are trying to cite developments of a period of history known as the Industrial Revolution and explain how those developments brought about urbanization and social and environmental changes. It's quite a bit, and so we'll split the standard into a two-part presentation. This will be part one of two. By urbanization, we're talking about the process by which cities grow and develop, how areas go from being non-city country areas to being developed city areas. The essential question that we're trying to answer, we have a couple of essential questions in this standard. The first is, what was the Industrial Revolution? Revolutions of all sorts are changes. This one was really a non-violent change. This isn't the American Revolution or the French Revolution where there's violence and war, but the Industrial Revolution was a change in how people work and how products get made. For most of history, from earliest cave people times up until the mid-1700s, people largely knew who made the clothes they were wearing, who grew the food that they were eating, who made the furniture in their house. Typically those things were made either in their own home or very close to their home. You might have a couple of things that came from far off places, but the majority of things that people had came from close to home. Okay, as we see in the picture here, the clothing was made in the home. The change that takes place in the Industrial Revolution is the change that results in life as we know it now. Chances are you have no idea who made the clothes you're wearing now. You have no idea who made the furniture in your house. Even the food that we eat usually is grown by people in far off places that we won't meet those people. We might never go to those places. Okay, that system and that change is what the Industrial Revolution is about and what we're going to take a look at in this standard. Okay, more specifically, the Industrial Revolution caused the demise of the cottage system and the rise of the factory system. By demise, we're talking about the death or the end of something. The Industrial Revolution ended the cottage system, and a cottage, as we see in the picture, is really a small house. As we mentioned just before, work was largely done in and around the home. In many cases, maybe the front of the house was the workshop and the back of the house was where people lived, or the people worked downstairs in the house and lived upstairs in the house. But the idea that home and work were very close to each other. The factory system is going to result in the construction of large buildings for the purpose of making things. We see in the picture here an example of an early factory in England, and there the work wasn't done by members of the same family. Work was done by strangers who all came from their homes to this building, and there they performed the jobs that had once been done in the home. So the cottage system disappears largely and is replaced by the factory system. We can see this change mapped out in a Venn diagram. The cottage system, as we mentioned, work was typically done at home. Okay, you lived and worked in and around the same building. In the home, products were made by hand. Okay, this was a slow process. Typically, there wasn't much machinery and technology in the home. The parts were often custom made. If a part broke, you needed to make a new part unique for that piece. But you were self-employed. People tended to be their own boss. They answered to themselves. They set their own hours. They paid themselves their own wages. The factory system that replaced the cottage system, work is now done outside the home. Work is done at the factory. Because the factory was equipped largely for making these products, you had better technology. You also had a system of production that develops called the assembly line. And as a result, the factory system tended to produce goods and products much more quickly. An idea called interchangeable parts develops, where each product that was made, the parts were the same in each one. So if a part in the first product broke, it was very easy and quick to replace that part with an identical interchangeable part. But you are now working for somebody else, typically a stranger, somebody not in your family who serves as your boss in the factory system. You're no longer determining your own hours. You're no longer determining your pay. In terms of similarities, both of these systems serve the purpose of producing the goods and products that people needed. Both of these products relied on money, okay, to buy and sell these products. And in both systems, the cottage system and the factory system, even though the process for making the products was different, a lot of the same products are being made by both systems. Okay, a piece of essential understanding we want to be aware of is that the Industrial Revolution begins in England. That's a key point. You might look at a map of the world, and England doesn't particularly stand out. It's part of the island of Britain, floating off the coast of Europe. But that island is where this change first occurs. Of all the countries on Earth, it begins here in England, and from there it's going to spread throughout Western Europe and the United States through the 17 and 1800s, and it's really continuing to spread really through the rest of the world, even as we sit here today. Okay, so our question is, of all the countries in the world, why England? What was it about England that causes this change to occur here first? And there's really three parts to the answer. The first was England had a large supply of the natural resources that the Industrial Revolution is going to require, in particular coal and iron. Those little black rocks in the ground, coal, for most of history really didn't have a lot of value. But in the Industrial Revolution, the need to create heat as a form of energy, to power these engines and these machines, the coal suddenly became very valuable. Iron, the same thing for the machinery, for the railroads that get built. Iron, which was always useful, becomes an even more valuable natural resource because of the Industrial Revolution. And England was just fortunate to have large supplies of these resources. We see here on the map in particular the northern parts of England and the northern parts of the island of Britain have a large supply of these resources. And again, in these factories, these products have a lot more value than they did before the Industrial Revolution. Okay, the second thing was a piece of technology that's invented in England, and that's called the steam engine. The steam engine is invented and improved in England. Okay, and we can think of the steam engine to the Industrial Revolution like the computer chip was or is to the computer technology revolution we're in now. That computer chip was invented in the United States and gave the United States an advantage in the world economy, the modern world economy. Back then, the invention of the steam engine in England is going to give it a big advantage. In fact, England makes it illegal to export, to send out of England steam engines for a number of years. They wanted to keep that advantage. If you've ever boiled a pot of water on the stove, you understand how a steam engine works. Heat is a form of energy. And when the steam rises up off the water and starts to rattle the lid on the pot, inventors start to realize if we could just channel that steam and connect it to something, we can now produce a very powerful source of energy. Okay, so the steam engine, which we see here through the heating of water, is going to produce movement and produce energy. That's key to the Industrial Revolution. This technology is invented and developed first in England. Okay, the third part to the answer here is something very particular to England, a thing called the enclosure movement, which goes on in England during the 17 and 1800s. And this movement forces peasant farmers off their land, and they really have no choice but to move into cities where they find work in these factories of the Industrial Revolution. The system of farming and life in England was pretty much unchanged for centuries before the Industrial Revolution. We should define here an enclosure is an area fenced in for private use. Before the Industrial Revolution, typically you had people living in small villages and towns. And there's no supermarkets. You don't go to a store to buy milk and eggs and things like that. You had your own animals, you had your own crops, but people living in a town or village didn't have the land for that. So they shared land. They had common pastures that the people in the town or village shared. Okay, these areas were used in common. We see here an example. This is a small English community called Datchet, about 20 miles outside of London. It's still a town today, but back in roughly 1700, we can see here two areas that were set aside for common use. Anybody in the town could use these areas to graze their animals, let their animals eat the grass there, and plant their crops. Well, what the enclosure movement does is it changes that. Here we see what an English community looked like typically before the Industrial Revolution. Okay, we see the barren, the blue areas would be the wealthy landowner in the area, and then the pink and the purple being other large, rich landowners. But you also had all those other colors representing small farmers. And these two big green areas represented the common areas that all of those other groups, all those other farmers shared. This is again where their animals grazed and ate the grass and where they planted their crops. The enclosure movement, though, is going to get rid of those common areas. The baron, the lord, the nobles, and the other rich farmers are going to be allowed to take over those areas that for centuries had been held in common. As a result of this, as we see in the chart, the amount of land is steadily going up that's being fenced off for private use. And these small farmers who don't have enough land of their own to graze their animals, who relied on those common areas, they're not going to have much option but to move into cities, to leave the farming life behind and move into cities where they become a cheap source of labor, of workers in the factories of the Industrial Revolution. That gave England a big advantage of having a large, cheap workforce to get the Industrial Revolution started. And that concludes the first part of Standard 9A.